Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku was the monster within part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story 𝗵𝑃𝗲 from AO3. So let's start the video. Underneath the harsh hospital lights, Kirishima examined the skin on his hands and forearms, searching for scars. Recovery Girl's kiss had smoothed away the violent lacerations that had covered his body, the tears and gashes where Rappa's onslaught shattered his hardened skin. What had been excruciating pain was now a shadow, a memory. The only evidence of his fight that remained were thin, pale lines that followed the ridges of his hardening, etched into his relaxed skin. Not quite scars. Not like what Midoriya had. Maybe that was for the best. He startled and looked up as the door to his room opened. A meek man wearing a white doctor's coat entered, followed by a woman with sharp, shrewd eyes. She closed the door behind them and stood to the side, fixing her serious gaze on Kirishima. The doctor spared her a solemn glance before turning to Kirishima and clearing his throat. "Kirishima-kun, you've almost been approved for discharge. We've already informed your teacher that you can go home soon," he said with a comforting but somewhat weak smile. "Really? Already?" Kirishima asked, and the doctor nodded. He jumped up from the bed, grinning. "Nice. But first, we have a matter of concern to discuss with you. Something that we need to address before you go." "A matter of concern?" Kirishima repeated. The doctor turned to the woman. "Nice to meet you, Kirishima-kun," she said. She smiled as well, but her eyes remained fixed, unfazed by the pleasantries. Something about them made Kirishima feel exposed, naked. "My name is Michiko Hannu. I specialize in matters of secondary genders here." Kirishima froze. "Secondary genders?" "Yes. You are an alpha, correct?" "Yeah." She examined him, her eyes taking in his expression carefully. "We found something disconcerting in your blood work." She paused as if expecting him to respond, but he went speechless, like a child caught in a lie. Embarrassment bubbled in his chest as he understood what she was implying. When he still didn't respond, she reached into her pocket and removed a familiar square tin that had once held harmless mints. "We ran the tests on my recommendation. My quirk is directly related to secondary genders, and I can sense when things aren't right, Kirishima-kun. What we found was 4 times the prescribed dosage of alpha suppressants in your bloodstream. And then, in your hero costume, we found this. More suppressants. Do you understand how serious this is?" 4 times. Kirishima repeated in dismay. "Yes. 4 times. Oh, that looks pretty bad, huh?" "It's not really like that." He put on a lopsided grin and ran his hand through his unstyled hair in an attempt to look sheepish. "Or, well, I guess it is like that since you ran the blood tests and you found, but it's just because of the mission, you know?" She watched him with those sharp eyes. "The mission?" "Well, yeah, we were rescuing a little girl. An abused little girl who had no one she could trust in the world, so I wanted to keep my head." He tried to hold her gaze, but he felt his face begin to glow with heat. Her expression didn't change. Her eyes seared into him, laying him bare, and something other than embarrassment started to roll in his stomach. "And these?" she asked. She opened the tin and removed the tissue that kept the suppressants from rattling. "They're safety measures," he said. "Just in case. I come from a long line of strong alphas, so it's good to take precautions. Right?" "I see." She turned to the other doctor. "I'll make a note on his record. He doesn't seem to be suffering any serious side effects for now based on the examination, and Recovery Girl likely worked out any internal damage regardless. We should schedule a checkup in the near future with his primary physician, just in case." The other doctor brightened. "Is that all, Dr. Hannu?" She sighed and nodded. "For now, yes. I would like to stay and talk to him about suppressant safety, but he can be discharged." Kirishima let out the breath he'd been subconsciously holding. Dr. Hannu moved to the computer in the room as the other doctor left to process paperwork. She made some digital notes, leaving Kirishima to stand in awkward silence. While she lingered, he could feel anxiety prickle along his skin. "I don't usually do that," he said after a few moments. "I don't usually take that much. Just when things get serious." "Is that so?" she replied. She did not look away from the computer. Yeah, it is. Kirishima-kun, do you know the consequences of alpha suppressant abuse? Kirishima's fists closed involuntarily. Kinda. Then you know that infertility is a common side effect, especially if you start to abuse young, don't you? Yes. And you don't care? It's, not that I don't care, it's just that. And do you know that if you overdose, which you were shockingly close to doing for this mission, you could suffer serious damage to your heart, kidneys, and liver? Total organ failure is not out of the question, especially if you regularly exceed the levels we just found in your blood. I don't, he said, but his head started pulsing again. Organ failure? He hadn't read that on the side effect list. I really don't. It was a special occasion. A fight with a villain is exactly the occasion not to take suppressants. You might have one, if you weren't taking the suppressants. She finally looked away from the computer screen and leveled her frigid gaze on Kirishima. Words caught in his throat. His mind stalled to the memory of blinding pain as his skin chipped away, leaving the bloody flesh beneath vulnerable to the sharp sting of the air. The sound of fists pummeling flesh, the horrible realization that someone he cared about might die right in front of him, with nothing but his broken body to stop it from happening, the fear and the fear of that fear. What do you mean? He breathed. It's a privilege to be an alpha as a hero, she said. Alphas have many natural advantages over the general populace, not just at superficial levels such as musculature and metabolism. Under the right circumstances, alphas can release incredible hormones that overcome the body's natural weaknesses. A berserker state, if you will. If you hadn't suppressed yourself so thoroughly, you may have won that fight, especially if you had something you desperately wanted to protect. I've never heard of anything like that. Of course you haven't. No one talks about it. She frowned deeply, looking away to glare at the computer screen. Society hasn't always been afraid of alpha heroes. I don't agree with Stain, of course, I'm not a villain, but he was right that heroes these days are too concerned about money and popularity. Kirishima's mind stumbled over the name Stain. The hair on his neck stood up, and the room suddenly seemed way too small to contain both him and Dr. Hannu. She continued, either unaware of his reaction or beyond caring. Alpha instinct should be something the public applauds, but it's seen as too aggressive, standoffish, unmarketable. Just look at 𝗫𝗓. The man is a prime alpha, but society is too busy fawning over beta all might to appreciate him the way he deserves. Beta heroes are safe. They're accommodating. They're mild. Alpha heroes, especially heroes like 𝗫𝗓 who refuse to compromise who they are, they're seen as too threatening, too harsh. Heroes have been domesticated in recent generations, and now they have young people like you choking down this poison to fight villains. She abruptly threw the tin of suppressants into the trash bin with an alarming clang. Kirishima jolted at the sudden sound, and she turned her cold glare on him. The energy in the room was heavy and oppressive. Do you think alpha villains are taking suppressants, Kirishima-kun? Her eyes seemed to glow. Kirishima shook his head and resisted the impulse to step away from her. Alphas are designed to rip the throats out of those who threaten their pack. You should have won that fight, Kirishima-kun, but they're teaching you how to be afraid of your instincts instead. That's not right, he said. Heroes shouldn't. Alphas should. You should. But you're afraid of what you should be. And you should be something to be feared, Kirishima-kun. I'm not. You are. She turned to the computer. I've got your charts right here. I imagine somebody told you that you were too much to handle when you were young and took the easy way out instead of getting you what you needed to grow into a strong, healthy prime alpha. They told you that you were dangerous, didn't they, Kirishima-kun? They made you afraid of yourself. They neutered you with those horrible pills before you were old enough to even understand what you are. The air in the room was too thick, cold, heavy. Kirishima swallowed. Am I free to leave? She leveled him with her chilly gaze and stared at him for an excruciating second. You are free to leave, she said. Think about what I said. It's not too late for you, Kirishima-kun. We can still fix this. Kirishima dropped his eyes to the floor and gathered his belongings as quickly as he could, shoving them into his bag, the sound of Dr. Hannu's fingers clicking away at the computer breaking like gunshots through the silent roar that filled his ears. He hauled the strap of the duffel bag over his shoulder and didn't look back at her as he slipped out the door. In the hall, The air was thinner, the weight lighter. He shuffled down several hallways before coming to a stop. He paused, closed his eyes, and inhaled deeply. Opening them, he looked down at his fist. The pale lines of his scars were hard to see in the bright light. A new, unwanted voice repeated in his mind, "You might have one, you know, if you weren't taking the suppressants." His jaw clenched, and he closed his fist. "I don't have any regrets," he assured himself forcefully. He readjusted the strap of the duffel bag on his shoulder and started towards the main lobby of the hospital. Kirishima's dorm room was significantly more comfortable and welcoming than his hospital room had been, but he couldn't sleep. When he closed his eyes, memories flashed through his mind. Pain, fear, frustration. So he stared at the ceiling and watched the moments tick by on the clock, watched shadows flicker through the cracks in his curtain to the balcony. After an hour, he gave in and pulled out his phone. He was sure that the others weren't sleeping either. He hadn't known Night Eye, but he did know he was dead, and Midoriya was sure to be dwelling on that. Uraraka was upset about his death, too, from the sound of it. Ajui, Suchan, was always hard to read, but he had learned from experience not to take that fact at face value. He thought about texting any one of them. They would get it. But it was because they would get it that he stopped himself. They needed their space. They had their own shadows to fight tonight. It was selfish, he knew, but his thumbs hovered over Bakugo's name. Bakugo had to get up early tomorrow for his remedial course. Bakugo liked to sleep. But, "You up?" Kirishima texted. He didn't really expect a response. It was a shot in the dark, just a little comfort. But after a minute, his phone buzzed. What it said? Kirishima stared at the screen and realized he hadn't thought this far ahead. He tapped at his phone, wrote and erased a couple dumb sentences, and finally settled on, "Did I wake you up?" "No," was the reply. "What do you want? Didn't you go to bed like 3 hours ago? What is this, a fucking test?" "No, I was just thinking. If you want to talk, come over here." Kirishima exhaled a short laugh through his nose. Of course Bakugo would see right through his bullshit. He sat up and crept to the room next to his, giving a short knock before entering. "I hate the way you text," Bakugo said as Kirishima closed the door behind him. He was slouching on his bed with his back to the wall, settled comfortably in the swells of his nest, and wearing a pair of athletic shorts and a sleep tank. If he really had been sleeping, he didn't show it. He never wore scent patches in his own room, and the air held the smell of him, marking the space as his territory. Kirishima breathed in the comfortable, familiar scent as he crossed the threshold into Bakugo's room. "I didn't even send any emojis," Kirishima replied. He was particularly fond of the muscled arm emoji, and this conversation was a safe exchange between them when words were hard to find. Bakugo rolled his eyes and extended his hand. Kirishima hesitated only briefly before walking over and sliding his hand over Bakugo's and down his forearm, resting the mild scent glands on their wrists against each other. Kirishima wasn't shy about sharing these intimate scenting moments with his friends. Wrists really weren't a big deal, just a small gesture of affection and solidarity. He bumped his wrists against Kaminari's and Sero's all the time, even though their beta scents were barely noticeable and his was dulled from suppressants. It felt right. Some kind of pack thing, an impulse from an earlier step in human evolution. Mixing his scent with his friends released a little flutter of happy hormones in him as an alpha, he knew, and it was one of the small perks of being an alpha he actually liked. Bakugo, though, maybe it was because he was an omega, or maybe it was because Kirishima had never seen him scent with anyone else. But Kirishima's body lit up when their wrists touched. When he brought his wrist away and inhaled the scent, the happy hormones dumped into his bloodstream and made him feel a different level of satisfaction. It had taken him by surprise the first time. He had first offered his wrist to Bakugo for Bakugo's sake not long after Kamino, when night after night he heard him rustling around in the room next to his, too restless to sleep. Bakugo usually had as much control over his scent as he did his quirk, but he couldn't keep the tinge of stress, frustration, and anxiety out of the smell of his room. It made Kirishima bristle when he'd finally entered for the first time. He hadn't been thinking when he reached out. It was instinct, a nagging impulse to comfort someone he cared for. As soon as he'd registered what he was offering, he was sure Bakugo was going to slap his hand away. but Bikugo had taken his hand. Kirishima still remembered his expression, a mixture of surprised, thoughtful, hesitant, all melting into a firm but veiled decision. Midoriya's words had echoed in Kirishima's head. It has to be you. Kirishima had never seen Bikugo share such intimate contact with anyone else and still hasn't, and Bikugo never asked for it. It was up to Kirishima to offer when he sensed a need in Bikugo, and he only offered when they were alone, when Bikugo's pride wouldn't be threatened by the idea of accepting comfort. Bikugo only extended his hand himself when it was for Kirishima's sake. And Kirishima didn't know how to express his gratitude except to melt fully into the contact and let Bikugo see the soothing effect it had on him. "Thanks, man," he said. "It's been a long couple of days." "How'd it really go?" Bikugo asked, studying his expression. "You were in the hospital, and you're hard to hurt." "Yeah, that's supposed to be my thing, huh?" Kirishima let out a small laugh and plopped down next to Bikugo, releasing his arm. He let the pheromones drift up from his wrist and breathed out a sigh. "I got the shit beat out of me, dude. Even with your unbreakable?" Yeah. The guy had a crazy quirk. His punches were like bullets. He broke through unbreakable in one hit, almost before I noticed he was there. I thought he was going to kill Fat Gum, and you know how tough that guy is. Bikugo turned to look at the wall opposite them, processing. "In one hit, huh?" "Yeah. It was scary, man. I almost lost my cool. But you didn't." "Nah, I kept it together. But I really did think he was going to kill Fat Gum. I couldn't stand by and watch that. What kind of hero would I be if I let someone die in front of me without giving my all? That's not manly. Even if..." The unspoken words hovered between them. Even if it killed me. They knew by now the weight of those words, spoken or unspoken. Kirishima lifted a fist. "I'm going to live without regrets. That's what I decided. I'm going to be a hero that protects people, and I'm not going to let fear get in my way. So you won?" Bikugo asked, turning his head to examine Kirishima. "Well, no, I got the shit beat out of me, like I said. But Fat Gum won, and that's what matters. He wouldn't have won if he fucking died, idiot." "Yeah, that's true. And I guess the villain respected me enough afterwards, because he said he'd come to kill me after he got out of prison. But like, in a manly way. A fight to the death between equal opponents." Bikugo snorted. "Is that what's bothering you? Heroes make enemies all of the time. It means you're doing your job right." Kirishima thought for a moment to argue, to say that nothing was bothering him and he was just too wired to sleep, but he knew that Bikugo could smell his disquiet, even if he tried to tone it down. He wasn't nearly as good at controlling his scent as Bikugo was, and Bikugo's nose seemed especially attuned to it lately, ever since Kirishima had been instructed to keep the 𝗧𝗂𝗧𝗏 a secret. It was as if Bikugo was trying to pull the truth directly from his scent itself. He sighed. "No, not really. I guess it's something else. Is it about your quirk? You still hung up on it?" "No." "Well, I still don't think it's as flashy and versatile as yours, and I still think I have to work twice as hard to keep up with everyone, but I get what you mean now about standing through anything. Even after I thought Unbreakable was done for, I still got back up, and that's what saved Fat Gum in the end. So, thanks for what you said before." He meant it. Bikugo's encouragement helped him more than a simple thanks could convey, but it was all he had. He threw Bikugo a bright grin to land home the point. For just a second, Bikugo's eyes widened, and then he settled into his own small smile. "Good," he said. "But then, so what's the problem?" Kirishima almost didn't reply. Bikugo narrowed his eyes, waiting, and Kirishima knew he'd let himself get backed into a corner. He sighed and leaned back. "It's just, there was a doctor at the hospital who, well, she said that I would have won the fight if I weren't taking suppressants. She said a lot of stuff, actually, but I guess that's what's bothering me." "Huh." Bikugo's face twisted into a scowl. That sounds like a load of bullshit. Bikugo didn't like to talk about secondary gender stuff. He especially hated when people brought up any should-s or shouldn't-s relating to alphas and omegas. Every time class came around to the topic, he clicked his tongue loudly enough to set off Ida. Kirishima understood, given the prejudice omegas still faced in society, especially as heroes. He avoided the topic when he could help it, and they almost never addressed the differences between them as an alpha and omega. Kirishima actually preferred it that way for his own reasons. But, do you really think so? I mean, if I weren't taking suppressants, would that actually make a difference? I dunno, man, it's just bothering me. Bakugo pursed his lips, which did nothing to reduce the harshness of his expression. I didn't even know you were on suppressants, he said after a moment. Oh yeah, I guess I should have led with that. I don't even know what alpha suppressants do. Come on, man, they suppress. It's not hard. Don't you take suppressants? No. Why the hell would I take suppressants? Kirishima opened and closed his mouth, and then shrugged. I dunno, I guess I just assumed. You have such good control over everything. Bakugo scoffed. That's because I know what I'm doing. How the hell am I supposed to be the #1 hero if I can't even manage my own damn hormones? A smug smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. Well, I'm not good at it, and I'm on suppressants, Kirishima replied with a hint of a pout. And now you're wondering if they're fucking you over as a hero, huh? Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, that can't be right, right? A lot of pro heroes use suppressants. Bakugo raised an eyebrow. Do they? I think so. Listen, I don't know shit about alpha suppressants. If you're so worried, why don't you ask that half-and-half bastard or ponytail? Or raccoon eyes? You knew her in middle school, right? No, man, I can't just ask about stuff like that. It's too embarrassing. And you do know they have names, right? You knew who I was talking about, Bakugo said, now at a full smirk. Well, I definitely can't ask Ishido or Yaozu. And Todoroki, I wouldn't even know how to bring it up with him. I don't know how to bring it up with anyone, really. We could knock on the wall and get Shoji in here, Bakugo offered mockingly, holding his knuckles up as if to rap on the wall. I bet he's listening in right now. He has too many ears. Kirishima grabbed his hand and pulled it down. No, I don't want to talk about it. I dunno. Like I said, it's just bothering me. I'll get over it. Bakugo rolled his eyes. Well, right now, you stink, and I don't want to wait for you to get over it. How much are you taking? What? What kind of dosage are you taking? Is it a lot? Yeah. You guess? Do you not know how much medication you're taking? Quit fucking around. Yeah, okay. I guess it's kind of a lot. I don't really go around asking how much is a standard amount of suppressants for an alpha to take. So you just down whatever pills some doctor shoves in your hands without thinking? What are you, stupid? Kirishima groaned and ran his hand through his hair, pushing it out of his face. No, but... Okay, fine. Yeah, I take a lot of suppressants. More than the average amount. It works for me, okay? Bakugo examined his expression, a dawning suspicion becoming apparent in the narrowing of his eyes. Heat rose in Kirishima's face as he realized what emotions he must be broadcasting in his scent, and he tried to dial it down. How much is a lot? Bakugo asked. You wouldn't know if I told you, right? You don't know anything about alpha suppressants. He pointedly avoided Bakugo's eyes. For a long couple moments, Bakugo didn't reply, and Kirishima began to hope he dropped it. But then, Kirishima heard him click his tongue with a distinct th. When was your last rut? Bakugo asked. Kirishima's heart jumped into his throat. Whoa, man, you don't just ask people stuff like that. He kept his eyes trained away, but to his dismay, a hand came up to grip his face roughly. Bakugo forced him to look at him. I can't remember you ever leaving for a rut, he said. Everyone else leaves. Hell, I'm absent when I have my heats. I never really thought about it before, but you never leave, do you? Kirishima said, because he didn't really want to say anything else. Bakugo's eyes bore into his. He swallowed, and a cold shame settled in his gut. I don't rut. Not since my first. Bakugo let go of his face, and his expression was unreadable. He studied Kirishima. Why? He asked, and then, is that even healthy? They said it would be fine, Kirishima said, rubbing his cheeks and looking away again. At least until I'm older. How old is older? You're an alpha teenager. You're supposed to rut. Yeah, I know, but sometimes things aren't that easy. Aren't that easy, how? I can't talk about this right now. It's just, like, I get the way it probably sounds, but it's not just a thing I woke and decided to do, okay? I have a doctor. My suppressants are prescribed, mostly. So, mostly, just forget I said anything about it, Kirishima said, standing up. The scent in the room wasn't comfortable anymore, and he knew it was his fault. It was impossible for 𝗵𝗃𝗲 to miss his agitation. He was almost afraid 𝗵𝗃𝗲 could hear the heavy, nervous beat of his heart. And he knew 𝗵𝗃𝗲 would keep pressing if he didn't stomp down on the conversation. It's not a big deal. If you don't even know anything about alpha suppressants, there's no point in talking to you anyway. You won't get it. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 grit his teeth into a deep scowl, just like Kirishima expected he would. But he was the one who said he didn't know about alpha suppressants in the first place, so he couldn't argue. Kirishima just hoped it wouldn't trigger him to do some kind of detailed research out of spite. I'll just talk to my doctor about it, he said a little more gently, turning away. I've got an appointment soon anyway. It's late, and you have to wake up early, so… Kirishima, 𝗵𝗃𝗲 said. Kirishima didn't turn around, expecting 𝗵𝗃𝗲 to say more, to argue, but 𝗵𝗃𝗲 just waited. Kirishima inhaled, wincing at the taste of his own apprehension lingering heavily on his scent, and turned to him. 𝗵𝗃𝗲's lips were pressed together in a hard line, and his brow was furrowed deeply. But all he did was extend his hand. His own scent floated beneath Kirishima's, and it was light, sweet, comforting. Kirishima inhaled again, willing himself to focus on the soothing pheromones 𝗵𝗃𝗲 was putting out for him, and he accepted his hand again to press their wrists together. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 watched him, searching his face for something. Go to the doctor and get your shit together, he finally said. Kirishima couldn't help but let out a weak laugh. Yeah, I will. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 let him go, and his hand fell to his side. He didn't want to leave, but he didn't want to stay either. He wanted to get closer to breathe in the comforting scent 𝗵𝗃𝗲 was making for his sake, to bury his nose in the potent scent glands on 𝗵𝗃𝗲's neck, but he wanted to be free from those calculating eyes. It felt like everyone was seeing into him too much recently. Good night, he said, and he left. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 sat across from Todoroki near the back of the bus on the way to their provisional licensing course. At the front, All Might and Present Mic talked back and forth about the 𝗧𝗏. Todoroki had noticed 𝗵𝗃𝗲 staring some time ago, and to 𝗵𝗃𝗲's annoyance, he wordlessly began to stare back, waiting for 𝗵𝗃𝗲 to speak. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 ground his teeth together and finally snapped, You're an alpha, right? Todoroki was visibly taken aback, but he answered, Yeah. Did you not know that? I knew. Do you take suppressants? No. Why? I thought you were an omega. I am an omega. I'm asking because… Kirishima. Todoroki's mouth opened, and something like understanding dawned on his face. I see. Are you too? It's not like that, bastard. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 snarled, a faint pink rising to his cheeks. He was saying some shit about alpha suppressants, but I don't know anything about them since I'm an omega. I don't know what's true or not on the internet, and I hate reading everyone's damn opinions about all of it. So I'm asking if you know anything. Todoroki considered the question in the new light and shrugged. I don't know much. Endeavor wouldn't let me take suppressants even if I needed them. That's more detail than I asked for, 𝗵𝗃𝗲 said dryly. Why doesn't he ask Ishido? They've known each other for a long time, right? That's what I said, but he said it's too embarrassing or some shit. Todoroki hummed, and he pulled out his phone. What are you doing? 𝗵𝗃𝗲 asked as he began to type. Texting Ishido. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 pursed his lips, deciding whether or not to stop him. A few moments passed, during which Todoroki's phone dinged a couple times, and then 𝗵𝗃𝗲's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Kirishima. What the hell, 𝗵𝗃𝗲? It read. Ishido said she'd talk to him, Todoroki stated. Back at the dorms, Kirishima continued to text 𝗵𝗃𝗲 furiously, and Mina hovered over his shoulder, shamelessly reading along. It's not that embarrassing, you know, she said. I take suppressants too. His thumbs paused mid-emoji. You do? Yeah. Because of the acid. I don't take much, but especially when I'm leading up to my rut, I have to be careful. Kirishima processed the statement and felt a figurative weight lift from his shoulders despite himself. He sighed and put his phone away, but not before sending his last line of angry text. I guess, if you're willing to talk about stuff like that, I could use the advice then. Of course. Come on. Let's go see 𝗵𝗲𝗄. What? Before Kirishima could sputter out a complaint, Mina hauled him to his feet and pulled him across the dorm to the table where Momo sat with Hagakure and Jairu. Mina pulled a seat out for him and plopped herself down next to Hagakure. Kirishima has some questions about alpha suppressants, if you're not too busy, she announced. Kirishima could feel the heat radiating off his face, but he was already in too deep. The only manly option was to suck it up and face the situation head-on. Your advice is appreciated, he said. He took the seat offered to him, trying to avoid making direct eye contact with anyone at the table. We're not too busy, Momo said, putting aside her books. But this is a little sudden. Are you already taking suppressants, Kirishima-kun? He nodded, red to the ears. What brought this about? Are you having complications? It would be best to consult with your doctor if that were the case. I have academic knowledge, but that only goes so far. It's not that, he said. His mind flashed to his hospital room, and the memory of Dr. Hanu's intense eyes brought his blush down. He sighed, crossing his arms. When I was at the hospital, there was a doctor there who said that I might have beaten the villain who bested me if I wasn't taking suppressants. And that bothered me, you know? She was saying stuff about some kind of berserker state that alphas can enter when there's something they really want to protect, and that my suppressants were taking that away from me. But I'd never heard anything about something like that. Have you? Wow, really? Mina said, leaning forward. I've never heard of that either. Sounds scary. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 added. Momo brought her hand up to her chin, thinking. I suppose it's possible, she said. But to me, it sounds like the doctor was describing what happens when an alpha goes feral, and that's a different matter entirely. The word feral rang through Kirishima's mind like a siren, and he felt the blood drain from his face. Isn't that a rutting thing, though? Alphas don't just, go feral in a regular fight, right? No, not usually, with or without suppressants, Momo confirmed. Kirishima let out the breath he was holding. Momo continued, it's strange that she would suggest to you that you could, or that she would recommend you stop taking your suppressants without consulting your primary physician. What else did she say? Well, Kirishima thought back to the uncomfortable conversation and felt the hair on his neck stand up again. She mentioned 𝗧𝗵𝗲 and how heroes have been domesticated. That people are all about beta heroes when they should be into alpha heroes, because alpha heroes were designed to protect and to kill if we have to. That alpha villains weren't taking suppressants, so we shouldn't either. A doctor said that? 𝗧𝗪 asked. She sounds like a nutcase. Yeah, what the heck? Mina agreed. Momo processed the report carefully, and after a moment, she pulled her computer to her and rapidly typed up a query. She scanned some web pages and documents before turning her screen to the others. This is what I suspect, she said. The phrase biological fundamentalism was highlighted across a wall of text, an entry in some online encyclopedia. Biological fundamentalism. Mina repeated, but before Kirishima could read much, Momo turned the screen back to herself to scan through the text. I've come across allusions to this social philosophy while doing my own reading about secondary genders, she explained. To summarize, biological fundamentalism posits the idea that quirks, meta-abilities, displace the natural biological hierarchy human beings should have based on secondary genders. According to this philosophy, humans are meant to exist in packs, with alphas at the top of the hierarchy as the natural leaders of society. Alphas are biologically superior, so it suggests. Beneath them are betas, the worker gender, and finally omegas, the breeder gender. But quirks toppled this hierarchy and destroyed the natural and proper power balance based on secondary genders. Momo paused and continued to read silently, frowning as she perused the text. Kirishima's mind ran through the conversation with Dr. Hanu. That sounds like the kind of stuff she was getting at. Yeah, he said. But isn't that unprofessional for a doctor to be pushing an agenda like that? 𝗧𝗵𝗃 asked. What about her omega patients? It sounds like she's prejudiced. There really are weirdos everywhere, aren't there? 𝗧𝗪 said, sighing. And it simply doesn't hold up, Momo agreed. Quirks are a product of human evolution. By this logic, we should be attempting to devolve as a species, rather than embracing the forward momentum of our natural evolution. All life forms evolve to fit the needs of their environment. So if quirks have appended the secondary gender hierarchy, humans should adapt. Yeah, Kirishima said. Yarozu, you always know what to say. A look of surprise flashed across Momo's face, followed closely by humble delight. Of course, I'm happy to help, she said. Her expression grew more serious. But I do hope you don't read too much into whatever this doctor was saying to you, Kirishima-kun. Secondary genders are, in the end, just hormones and instinct. They're founded on the same impulses that guide our fight-or-flight response, or the urge to eat sweets. Biological fundamentalists might say that, for instance, omegas should never become heroes because they're particularly vulnerable to alpha commands. But just as someone can be trained to override their fight-or-flight impulses in certain situations, or we can resist the urge to amass calories through sugar, anyone can train themselves to reevaluate their instincts and not act on those that aren't useful. Omegas do not have to follow alpha commands. They just feel an especially strong impulse to do so in the moment. And alpha aggression might have been useful in older eras of human evolution, but now it can be a problem just as much as a solution. If your hormones are unbalanced or maladapted to modern life, you shouldn't be ashamed of taking suppressants. You're not less of a hero for that, Kirishima-kun. The words hit Kirishima like an answer to a question he didn't know he'd been desperately asking. It was like he could inhale them, drink them into his lungs. He clamped his jaw down and closed his fists to keep himself from turning sappy, and he concentrated as much as he could to keep his overwhelming relief from leaking out in his scent. It was exactly what he needed to hear. Almost as if she could read his mind, or perhaps she was just reading his smell. Mina patted him gently on the shoulder. "We do what we have to as heroes, Kirishima," she said, and her own acidic scent emphasized her words. Her alpha pheromones weren't nearly as pleasant to Kirishima as 𝗵𝗃𝗲𝗏, but he appreciated the gesture nonetheless. "Yeah," he said. He let himself bask in the reassurances for a moment and grinned. "Heroes do what they have to. I'm not ashamed of taking suppressants if it lets me do my best. But I do have another question about suppressants, if you know, 𝗧𝗪𝗧." "Of course," she said, gesturing for him to continue. "The doctor, she said that too many suppressants could cause organ failure. I never read that in any of the side effects on my medication. Was she just exaggerating?" Momo tipped her head in acquiescence. "It can happen," she said. She wasn't exaggerating. It's more likely that, as a minor, you're taking weaker, more gentle versions of the medication, so it's almost impossible to do that much harm. It can be dangerous to prescribe the stronger suppressants to minors, individuals whose bodies are not yet mature, as they can hamper development. Overdoses that are serious enough to cause organ failure are more likely in older alphas, especially if they abuse the more specialized over-the-counter suppressants, like heat prep injections. A flash of panic spiked through Kirishima, but he shoved it down forcefully before it could be broadcasted in his scent. "I see," he said, putting on a smile. "That's good then. You shouldn't be in a position to worry about side effects of that nature," Kirishima-kun, Momo said, eyeing him. "Right, Kirishima?" Mina pressed, poking him painfully in the arm and leaning in close. Kirishima wished she wouldn't. Even with the suppressants, having another alpha in his space when he was nervous made him bristle just a bit. Not enough to cause any problems, but enough to make him uncomfortable. He wondered suddenly if her own suppressant usage let her be so comfortable around other alphas. Momo never seemed to have any trouble either, or Ida, or Sadu, or Shoji. Todoroki, well, maybe he had more trouble when it came to interacting closely with other alphas, but he never seemed to show close intimacy with anyone anyway. Maybe Todoroki was more like him. Kirishima focused on that line of thought, rather than dwelling on the suppressant problem. No, I'm fine," he said. "It was just something the doctor said. I wasn't sure if she was, trying to freak me out into stopping or something like that." "You should get a different doctor," 𝗬𝗪 commented. "She's not my real doctor. She was just at the hospital. Can you file a complaint?" Maybe. I don't want to, though. Isn't that going too far?" "Well, if she's being a problem for patients, it's not," Hagakure said. "She wasn't a problem. She just freaked me out a bit. I'm sure she does her job well enough." Kirishima remembered something she said and commented, "Her quirk is related to secondary genders, so she's probably good to have in a hospital, actually." "Well, just don't take her too seriously," 𝗬𝗪 said. "Yeah, I won't." Kirishima took the opportunity to stand up. "Thanks, guys. I feel a lot better now. And don't hesitate to come talk if you need to," Mina said with a smile. "Yamamoto knows everything after all." "I'm just glad to help," Momo said, but she glowed at the praise. "I will." Kirishima said, and he gave them a small wave as he walked away, heading to the stairs to his room. His mind rattled with thoughts as he meandered up to his floor. Bakugo was still gone, and Shoji was probably out doing something on their day off. Kirishima slipped unimpeded into his room and shut the door. Even though he knew he wouldn't be bothered, he couldn't help but click the lock shut. In the privacy of his room, he finally let himself process what Momo had said about suppressants and side effects. Hesitantly, he moved to drop into the chair at his desk. To his right were the desk's 2 drawers. He opened the bottom of the 2, which was stuffed full of his school supplies. Pencils, pens, erasers, tape, note cards, the works. Behind it all was a box, tucked in the back where it was hard to reach, where fidgety snoopers like Kaminari would be too deterred to investigate. Kirishima dug the box out and pulled off the top, assessing its contents. Alongside his prescribed suppressants, he kept a stock of over-the-counter suppressants that might come in handy. He couldn't waste his prescribed doses by taking too many. The pills were limited. He had found that he could supplement his dosage by adding the slow-releasing, powerful injections alphas took before sharing a heat with omegas they weren't bonded with. When he knew they were going to have a high-stress lesson or drill coming up, sometimes he would inject a quarter or half dose of his over-the-counter heat prep suppressant to last him through the week. He also kept extra pills in his stash, some basic daily pills and some more powerful stuff made to stave off an untimely rut, just in case. Just in case. He had only just injected a full dose of the heat prep suppressant for the first time before the 𝗧𝗂𝗧𝗏 raid. He just wanted to be sure. He had to be on top of himself to guarantee he would stay level-headed in a real-life hero situation. Any surge of untimely aggression had to be stamped out so he could concentrate on his hero work fully, without regrets. But thinking about it now, he realized that, doing it like this, he really had no idea how much suppressants he had in his body at any given time. He hadn't been keeping proper track of when he took what in what dosage, how the dosages would stack, what they would do to him when they did pile up in his system. Maybe he really did have 4 times the prescribed amount of suppressants in his blood when he was fighting Rappa. No regrets. He had important decisions to make, important people to protect. He had to have full control over his quirk, to push himself to his limits, to be unbreakable against villains but gentle for those he was trying to save. He promised himself he wouldn't go back to how he used to be. But organ failure, that wouldn't work either. A hero can't do hero work if they're dead. Kirishima let out a slow sigh and started sorting through his stash, removing his extra over-the-counter suppressants, one by one, laying them on the desk. It was more than he remembered having. He knew that he should throw it all away and go back to his prescribed dose. Organ failure was going too far. But feral. The word blazed across his mind against his will. It felt like a burn, like a lesion deep beneath his skin, torn so deep it ripped even into the psychic fabric of his being. He hadn't thought about that word in a long time, not since he started doubling down on his doses. You should be something to be feared, Kirishima-kun, the doctor's voice echoed through his skull, now another voice in the ringing chamber of his past. I've got your charts right here. Goosebumps erupted across his skin, and his mouth ran dry. He stared at his collection of extra suppressants. He knew he should throw them away. He knew, but I'll just stop for a while and see how it goes, he whispered to himself. At least until I see the doctor. Just give my system some time to clean itself out. Saying it out loud made it feel like he was committing to the decision, but he still clenched his jaw, evaluating the medications. Finally, he swept his arm across the surface of the desk and dumped the vials and containers back into his secret box. He buried the whole thing into the back of his desk drawer, where no one would think to look. The hype and flurry of activity around the school festival drove Kirishima's uncertainties to the back of his mind, where the rest of the unsavory alpha business stayed locked away, and the months that followed blurred past in a similar haze. Hero work took precedence. The work study with Fat Gum, the League of Villains, the Meta-Liberation Front, a slew of new and old criminals wreaking havoc on society. He didn't have time or energy for hormones in the desperate rush to keep up, to claw his way forward with the rest of his classmates, to get better, stronger. At the very least, he was more careful with his suppressants. He was as religious as ever with his prescribed dose, but no more full-dose heat prep injections on top of it. Half a dose of the injection max when serious hero work or practical exams were on the horizon. Only occasional extra over-the-counter pills on his hormonal upswing when the gnawing itch grew in him and the shadowy lust for omega pheromones swelled. Only then, he beat himself into submission with a small, slight overdose. Something little, barely enough to upset his stomach or cause his heart to palpitate. The over-the-counter medication stayed in his box, and the extra tin of emergency suppressants stayed in the back pocket of his hero costume. Just in case. His primary physician finally broached the topic of rutting once he reached his 3rd year at UE. Kirishima asked to put it off until after graduation. He could prepare for it then. He could work his life around it, find an apartment to get the privacy and independence he couldn't have at the dorms, research facilities and check into the most appropriate one, understand the tranquilizers so that he would know how to use them properly. His physician understood. Bakugo, the only one who watched his attendance record like a stalking cat, understood less, but he learned quickly that Kirishima wasn't interested in turning it into a debate. Instead, he became infuriatingly passive-aggressive. He prodded Kirishima for information about his health record and drilled him whenever he came back from a doctor's appointment. He buried his face in Kirishima's pillow and commented on the mildness of his alpha pheromones while Kirishima struggled to understand math. He blasted his scent loudly whenever they worked out together. He announced to Kirishima every time he left for his heat, making a show of asking Kirishima for worn clothes to fill out his nest and talking the second he returned about how refreshing it was to be a proper fucking adult with a working hormonal cycle. And he did it all with a glare, a scowl, and an occasional explosion. Kirishima pointedly ignored him. He just hoped he didn't go so far as to buy him pheromone spray or a sex toy. It was hard to say if Bakugo was above that or not. When Aizawa-sensei informed the class that they would have another training drill with 1B in the early fall of their 3rd year, a month before Kirishima's 18th birthday, Kirishima only took a quarter of the heat prep injection on the Monday of that week. It would settle any undue anticipation and anxiety, and it would last through the training. The morning of the drill, he took only half of an extra suppressant. A milder one, not the hardcore rut suppressants. It would be enough to keep him calm, even if he went head-to-head with another strong alpha like 𝗧𝗓𝗧𝗏. Satisfied, he changed in the locker room with the rest of the guys in his class and admired the look of his updated hero costume with confidence. Following UE protocol for alpha and omega students during practicals, he adhered scent patches to the glands on his neck. They were at ground beta this time, and the 2 classes merged in the underground observation room, where they could watch the live feed broadcasted from the various cameras scattered throughout the buildings in the artificial city. Vlad-sensei provided the scenario. You will be divided into villain and hero groups, he stated. You will draw from this box to decide which group is which. The villains have a valuable hostage, and the heroes need to retrieve the hostage unharmed while also defeating the villains. Any questions? A chorus of understood went up, and they conducted the usual business of dividing into teams. Kirishima. Mina called happily, revealing that they had been funneled together. Ajaru and Siro joined them as well. All right, we got this, Kirishima said, putting his fists together. This is a good group. And it seems like we're up first. Who are we up against? Siro asked, looking over at 1B. Kurwaro, Kendo, 𝗧𝗓𝗧𝗏, and Tsuburaba, Ajaru said. And it looks like they're the villains. Woohoo, we're the heroes. Mina cheered. It always feels better to be the heroes. Ajaru waved for them to huddle up, and they all put their heads together. What do you think? Let's see, Kirishima's a natural match for 𝗧𝗓𝗧𝗏, and they can both be stubborn hotheads, Siro said, eyeballing their opponents. He ignored Kirishima's protests. I can deal with Kendo, Ajaru offered. She has big hands, and I have a tail. We can work with that. Kurwaro might be a problem, though he can scout us out easily by traveling through the shadows, and we don't have any good reconnaissance quirks on our side. Yeah, and Tsuburaba is getting pretty good with that solid air quirk. Mina added. My quirk might be useful for retrieving the hostage though, Siro said, flashing a grin. As long as Tsuburaba is out of the way, there's not much to stop my tape. We'll have to get to them first, Kirishima said. They don't have a lot of mobility besides Kurwaro, so they'll probably hole up and reinforce their base, right? I'll just melt down their reinforcements with my acid. Mina replied. Steel melts, too, if you want me to take care of 𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧. They won't see that coming. She punctuated the statement with a devious snicker. Melting people with acid isn't very heroic. That's what Recovery Girl is for. Kirishima glanced around. Is she here? No, but she's on standby, 𝗧𝗪𝗢 replied. They said she'll come by later with All Might after they clean up whatever the second years are doing. Today's a busy day for everyone, huh? Aizawa-sensei finally clapped his hands and called for everyone to finalize their preparations so they could begin the drill. His tired voice didn't float well over the conversations, but the students were well attuned to his drawl and knew when to pay attention. So we're beginning with the first round. Teams 1 and 2, take your positions. Villains, you have 10 minutes for setup, and then the heroes will begin. And so we don't have any repeats of our previous mishaps. Aizawa glanced pointedly at Midoriya and Bakugo. You will all be provided with these communication devices during the drill. We will hear what you say, and we will let you know if you're overdoing things. Be on your best behavior. Kirishima followed his team out of the room, securing the earpiece and microphone combo to his ear and running the wire down his back so the small box could sit in his back pocket. Don't these things seem like they'll break? The way you do things, sure, 𝗧𝗏 joked. They loitered around outside the designated building while the 1B team made the preparations. After 10 minutes, they heard Aizawa's voice speak directly into their ears. Engage. You have 30 minutes. Keep an eye out for 𝗬𝗬𝗧𝗏, 𝗧𝗪𝗢 reminded them as they slipped into the building. Man, but how do we know where they are? We're actually really at a disadvantage here, Kirishima said as they ran along a dimly lit hallway. If I were a villain, I would be on the top floor. That way heroes couldn't get the drop from above, Mina stated. I would also take out the elevators so the heroes would have to use the stairs. That would make them tired before the fight even began. Stairs are this way. Chin up, Kirishima. Should we scout ahead? 𝗧𝗏 asked as they began to climb. We're going to have to check every floor, just in case. I can, 𝗧𝗪𝗢 began, but a quiet sound cut him off. They all came to a stop outside the access door to the second floor and listened. Mina motioned for them to be quiet and opened the door a crack. The sound became a fraction louder, confirming that it was indeed coming from the second floor. But what is that? Kirishima whispered. That sounds like someone's hurt? An omega, right? Mina said. That's an omega sound. She exchanged glances with Kirishima and then looked to 𝗧𝗪𝗢, the only omega in the group. He frowned. That's a heat noise, he whispered. A call for help. What are they trying to do? And isn't this too early? This is a bad strategic position, isn't it? 𝗧𝗏 said. I don't like this, Kirishima muttered. The distant, distressed keening was sending shivers through him, even with the extra suppressants he took. Some underused corner of his brain lit up with a deep, primal urgency to find and protect, to make the sound stop. His gums ached with the impulse to bite. He glanced at Mina, and he saw in her eyes that she felt the same way. If this is a trick, it's a dirty one. Well, they are villains, right? 𝗧𝗏 said. And they are supposed to have a hostage. Maybe they're acting like that's the hostage calling for help? It's weird, Kirishima said. Do they even have an omega on their team? 𝗬𝗏, 𝗧𝗪𝗢 replied. But I doubt he'd do something like this. And that sound isn't something you can just make. I couldn't do it right now if I tried. Maybe Shinsu's artificial vocal cords? He's not on their team. Well, we have to investigate it, right? 𝗧𝗏 said, pushing the door open. He turned to the rest of them and, seeing them hesitate, sighed. I'm a beta, so it's not such a big deal for me. Do you want me to scout ahead? Kirishima squared his shoulders. We should stick together. We're stronger that way, and if it has anything to do with 𝗬𝗬𝗧𝗏, we don't need you to be picked off early. He didn't want to admit that he was too antsy to sit and wait. The call made him feel like he downed way too much caffeine, and he needed to move. And he had taken his suppressants, right? He could control himself. A noise wasn't enough to scare him away. Carefully, 𝗧𝗪𝗢 whispered, and the others replied with solemn nods. They hunkered down and moved silently through the building, using hand signals to communicate. The noise was easy to follow, but the closer they got, the quicker Kirishima's heart beat. The sound was almost unbearable. It seemed to reverberate through his body, lighting up his cells. He caught himself grinding his teeth, and more than once, he had to swallow a growl when one of the others moved too close too suddenly. As if she was thinking the same thing, Mina hung back, putting 𝗧𝗏 and 𝗧𝗪𝗓 between him and her so another alpha wouldn't trigger whatever bizarre aggression was stirring to life in them. 𝗧𝗪𝗓 hunched, the hair on his head and tail puffed. Kirishima had never been so glad Yui made them all wear scent patches on the field. They finally came to a stop outside a room with a door left ajar. It was clear the sound was coming from within, and the desperate keening was like physical needles on Kirishima's skin. They pressed against the wall. Kirishima looked back at 𝗧𝗏, asking him wordlessly to be the one to go ahead. Behind him, he saw Mina's teeth bared, and he related wholeheartedly. 𝗧𝗏 snuck ahead and carefully, making as little noise as possible, peeked through the crack in the door. The sound immediately stopped. 𝗧𝗏 froze in place, a look of confusion plastered across his face. "You can come in," a voice said from within. It didn't belong to anyone in 1B, but it was familiar to Kirishima. He sometimes heard it in his sleep, telling him that he was meant to rip out villains' throats. It lived in the vault at the back of his mind where he stored the parts of himself he would rather deny. "Who?" 𝗧𝗏 asked, pushing the door open. They all moved forward to look. Kirishima sucked in air as his suspicions were confirmed. "Do you remember me, Kirishima-kun?" Dr. Hannu asked. She sat perched on a dusty office desk, a laptop settled comfortably on her lap. Her dark hair had begun to gray, despite her being no older than 40, and it was pulled up into a neat bun. She wore a white doctor's coat. Even if she hadn't looked almost exactly the same as she did 2 years ago, Kirishima would have instantly recognized her piercing eyes. "You're from the hospital," he said, moving slowly into the room. Something screamed danger in his mind, but he pushed it away. How dangerous could it be? She was just a doctor. He really wanted to believe that. "You know her?" Mina asked, following him hesitantly. "What's going on?" "I'm here to help you. Just like I said I would, Kirishima-kun," Dr. Hannu said. "I'm glad you remember me." "Wait, but," 𝗧𝗏 said, frowning, "how did you get past security? Civilians shouldn't be here. This is Yui property." "I got clearance as Kirishima's primary physician," Dr. Hannu replied smoothly, "to check on the problem we discussed some time back. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, Kirishima-kun, but there wasn't a good time to see you otherwise." A shiver ran down Kirishima's spine. "You're not my primary physician. Some things have changed recently." Like before, her eyes seemed to glow, to 𝗧𝗏. "This meeting took quite a bit of time and work to arrange. I was hoping it would be more private, but we must take the opportunities that were given. Would you like to introduce me to your friends? I see we have another alpha, a beta, and an omega with us today." Mina lifted her hand to her earpiece. "Sensei?" They all heard the reply. Aizawa's voice was sharper, the usual fatigue muted. "We're looking into it. Keep her distracted. Get her name if you can." Dr. Hannu, Kirishima stated from memory. "Michiko Hannu." "It's lovely to meet you all," she said, and if she knew he was talking into a microphone, she didn't show it. "But it would be best if the rest of you left now. For confidentiality's sake. Now then." She turned her attention to her laptop and began to type. She spent a wordless moment arranging the windows via the touch screen, and she finally lifted her eyes. "I suppose this means you all intend to stay?" "We don't know you. We're not going to just leave Kirishima alone with you," Mina said. Her fangs were still bared, prepared by the Omega's cries. Kirishima noticed with a jolt that there was no Omega in the room. No one but Hannu. She didn't smell like an Omega. Dr. Hannu sighed and shifted on the desk, then began without fanfare. "Last time we met, Kirishima-kun, you had 4 times the prescribed suppressants in your system. You told me at the time that you had overdosed due to the important mission you were undertaking with your work study. A reasonable excuse, perhaps. However," her eyes bored into his. "Today, 2 years later, you're doing a standard drill at your school with indisputably low stakes, and you still have twice the amount prescribed in your bloodstream. I can smell it." Kirishima froze as he felt 3 sets of eyes fall on him. "Isn't this illegal? For you to be saying things like that publicly?" "You exceed your prescription frequently," she stated as a fact, ignoring him. I knew that from the second I met you. It exudes from your pores. I would hazard to say that you should be several centimeters taller than you are right now, and your shoulders should be broader. Your musculature is adequate but could be better. You've doubtlessly damaged your development, Kirishima-kun, and you will have to live with that consequence for the rest of your life. No, seriously, Kirishima said, holding up his hands to stave her off. He wanted to shrug, to laugh and make light of it so his friends wouldn't stare. But she was looking at him just like she did at the hospital, and the air was cold, thick, heavy. I'm at school. I've done some digging, Kirishima-kun. Alpha children are brought in for regular checkups after every rut until they reach adulthood. You don't have any records. You haven't had a rut since your first pup rut, after which your parents and primary physician agreed to put you on a heavy suppressant regime, one of the most extreme I've seen. He's dead now, by the way. The air crystallized. What? Kirishima breathed. A sharp memory of the kind man who had been his doctor since he was child drove the blood from his face. Dead? Their earpieces crackled to life. Retreat and wait for us, Aizawa ordered, but Kirishima could barely process the words. As I said before, I have access to your charts, Hanyu continued. Your levels are truly spectacular, Kirishima-kun. You're a model prime alpha, a perfect storm of genetics. In a bygone era, you would have been raised as a prince among paupers. But we don't live in a bygone era, and it would seem that your quirk posed a particular problem for those around you. Your records state that you had to be subdued by police during your first rut and brought to the hospital to spend the rest of it heavily sedated. You injured your father. Is that correct? Your father is also an alpha who is heavily dependent on suppressants, and your grandfather was registered as a prime alpha himself, according to my sources. It's in your DNA. You're a perfect alpha, born into a perfect tragedy. I never stopped grieving for you, Kirishima-kun, but I've finally come to help fix it all. Dr. Hanyu set her laptop aside and slipped off of the desk. In a flash of pink, Mina moved forward, and a warning splash of hissing liquid sprayed across the room, landing at Hanu's feet. It sounds to me like you need to mind your own business, she snarled. At the same time, 𝗧𝗪 lunged forward and grabbed onto Kirishima's elbow. Let's go, he hissed. Hanu's eyes narrowed, and the air in the room immediately filled with repugnant, sickly sweet pheromones. Everyone's hands flew to cover their noses and mouths, even 𝗧𝗪's. They choked on the scent as they breathed it in. Instinct rang alarm bells in their heads. It screamed danger, and to the alphas, it begged, help me. Kirishima could feel adrenaline and a slurry of other hormones dumping into his blood. My quirk is instinct, Dr. Hanyu explained, her voice crisp and cold. I can manipulate the instinct response in secondary genders. I can replicate perfectly the scent and sound of a distressed omega or a blood-crazed alpha. Be careful. Alphas are programmed to protect, and I can make you desperate to save me from each other. Why are you here? Kirishima choked out. What do you want? I'll show you. Slowly, as if she were approaching a wild animal, she took steps towards Kirishima. The smell in the air shifted to something more pleasant, disarming. A desirable pheromone that clouded up Kirishima's mind into a hazy fog that slowed his beating heart, pulled the adrenaline from his blood, willed him to relax. But he had taken enough suppressants to resist, and his rational mind stayed sharp and lucid. He stepped back, one hand still clamped over his nose and his other hardening in self-defense. He forced a growl from his throat to remind himself to stay alarmed and alert. She didn't pause. Restrain him. The sudden alpha command rattled Kirishima, but before he could process it, muscular arms and a thick, powerful tail whipped around him. He gasped and looked back to a white GI and golden hair. Agi. Something sharp plunged into his neck. He felt liquid disperse under his skin. He hadn't thought to harden his whole body, between the pheromones and the shock of 𝗧𝗪 holding him in place. The arms around him disappeared as 𝗧𝗪 stumbled backwards, eyes wide and breath coming in rapid pants, and a sudden wave of dizziness brought Kirishima to his knees. What? He gasped, grabbing at his neck. An EpiPen-like needle came away. That serum will neutralize any suppressants currently in your system, Dr. Hanyu stated. She hovered over him long enough to peel his scent patches away, and in the brief moment, He caught a glimpse of a support item, a utility gauntlet of sorts hidden beneath the loose sleeve of her coat, connected to a small, flesh-colored pad in the palm of her hand. She retreated back to the desk. The air was putrid with the distressed 𝗲𝗍𝗲 pheromones again, repelling everyone away from her and manipulating Mina's alpha instinct to protect, but now Kirishima's dense, panicked stench joined it. Kirishima looked up at her, eyes wide. She held his gaze and continued. It will also enhance and strengthen your natural virility. It will be like the damage was never done. Maybe even better. Kirishima lowered his eyes down to the needle. Barely thinking, he dropped the cylinder and reached into his back pocket, pulling out his tin of spare suppressants. The box attached to his headset jostled out with the tin, yanking the headset from his face, all of it clattering in a messy pile to the ground. His hands trembled as he opened the lid of the tin. The pills rattled once the tissue was lifted away. "You'll just throw them up," Dr. Hanu said. "You'll waste them. You wouldn't want that, would you?" "Why are you doing this?" he gasped. He couldn't hold the tin steady enough to pluck out the small, round discs, so he dropped it. His body felt weird. He was hot. His muscles pulsed and ached. His scent was acrid. "I told you, Kirishima-kun. I'm helping you. Society shouldn't fear strong alphas. It should demand them. You're not anyone's show pet. I'll prove to you what you're really capable of achieving." She turned to the other three. Mina's black eyes were wild with rage, and her teeth stood out like white daggers, but the pheromones scrambled her mind. The rational part of her knew that Hanu was her enemy, but it was beaten down, fighting a losing battle beneath the foggy instinct that made her wholly unwilling to attack a distressed 𝗲𝗍𝗲 begging for help with its scent. 𝗓𝗪𝗓 fell to his knees, reeling from the command and what it had compelled him to do. Hanu looked at 𝗧𝗏, the only one who still had anything close to his wits about him. "You should leave," she told him. "This will trigger his rut, and it will hit him quickly and violently, much more so than what would be natural. His body needs to make up for lost time and properly flex its neglected systems. The serum is still in its trial stages, and combined with his years of suppressant abuse, there is no way to tell how this will turn out. I can't guarantee he won't kill you. Except you, 𝗲𝗍𝗲." She turned to 𝗓𝗪𝗓, who looked up at her with new horror. "You can stay. He could use your company, and I can make sure he doesn't hurt you." Kirishima doubled over, wrapping his body up in his arms, his hardening activating and deactivating in disjointed waves. Strong, unimpeded pre-rut pheromones already rolled heavily from his scent glands. The pupils of 𝗓𝗪𝗓's eyes blasted open at the smell. He bit his lip hard enough to draw blood, but he couldn't make himself move. "Do not let that happen," 𝐈𝐧𝐿 yelled into their ears. "Shit," 𝗧𝗏 breathed, and he shot out a whip of tape to take hold of 𝗓𝗪𝗓's waist. With a strong yank, he threw 𝗓𝗓𝗓 out of the door, and he moved quickly to do the same for Mina. "I'm sealing them in, sensei," he shouted into his microphone as he barreled from the room and slammed the door shut. With a few deft movements, he plastered the door with tape, finally closing them off from Hanu's dangerous pheromones. The students of both 1A and 1B stood in shocked silence as 𝗧𝗏 passed the microphone to Vlad. "Call your students back, especially the alphas and omegas. Beta students can stay to provide support. If her quirk only seriously affects alphas and omegas, we should be able to handle this without trouble. Will you need reinforcements?" Vlad asked. "You can't come. You're an alpha, and we don't know how much of that serum she has on her," 𝗧𝗏 said. He paused and added, "Call in Midnight and 𝗵𝗲𝗏 to take care of Kirishima." "Sensei, Midnight is an 𝗲𝗍𝗲," Momo cut in nervously. "And her quirk is perfect for handling feral alphas," 𝗧𝗏 replied. "She's a seasoned pro hero. She's dealt with this sort of thing before. Once we've captured Hanu, there shouldn't be an issue." A murmur traveled at the word feral. 𝗧𝗏 moved towards the exit, passing Kaminari, Uraraka, Midoriya, and finally Bakugo. "Sensei," Bakugo growled. "Don't even think about it," 𝗧𝗏 said. He stopped and fixed Bakugo with an intense glare. "I know you're close to Kirishima, but the last thing we need is a headstrong 𝗲𝗍𝗲 diving into a situation with a hormone-manipulating villain and a rutting, potentially feral alpha. You will make the situation worse for everyone if you leave this room. Midoriya, the same goes for you. As omegas, you are both strictly prohibited from engaging. Understood?" Yes, sir, Midoriya responded, but Bakuga grit his teeth. He's not feral, he said. Not yet, but he's still with the villain, Aizawa said. We're going to rescue him, hopefully before it gets to that point. If you get involved, it will make everything worse. Stay here. He turned to leave. As the door clicked shut, Vlad turned back to the screens and lifted the microphone up. He clicked a button on the control panel. Villain group, he said, we have a situation. The drill is cancelled until further notice. Exit quickly through the west wing. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 𝗔𝗂𝘁𝗵𝗲, you need to retreat to the underground observation room immediately. No arguments. Kendo Korwaro, you can stay to provide support for Eraserhead. Kendo, 𝗧𝗵𝗲, and 𝗔𝗵𝗲 sat idly in a room at the top floor of the building, surrounding the training dummy that served as their hostage. Korwaro had already disappeared into the shadows of the building. Kendo frowned as the message finished transmitting and lifted her hand to the microphone on her earpiece. What's the situation? She asked. Vlad hesitated a beat but replied, there's a villain on the premises. She's captured Kirishima. Kirishima? 𝗧𝗵𝗲 repeated. Where are they? We have to. You were given the order to fall back, 𝗧𝗵𝗲, Vlad snapped. But sensei, Kirishima is. All alphas and omegas are to evacuate immediately. The villain's quirk is instinct, and Kirishima has been forced into a rut. 𝗧𝗵𝗲's mouth snapped shut, and he grimaced. Understood, he said. Kendo reached up to pat him on the shoulder. I'll help him on your behalf, 𝗧𝗵𝗲, she said gently. To Vlad, she said, Korwaro is somewhere in the building. Have you heard from him? Vlad scanned the screens, clicking a button to cycle through different camera feeds. Korwaro. Confirm. Korwaro finally popped out of the shadows on the third floor. Do you know how hard it is to use a microphone when I'm in the abyss? He said. When the situation calls for you to use the microphone, use the microphone. I copy. I'm going to check on the situation now. Vlad frowned, calculating, and then said, they're on the second floor, east wing. Do not engage until Eraserhead is there. You can keep an eye on things, but stay out of the way. Korwaro smirked. Roger. He darted off through the shadows, picking his way through patches of black down the stairwell to the second floor. As he approached the east wing, the low, heavy sound of panting became audible. He followed it to a door covered in Sero's tape. Inside, Kirishima stayed huddled on the ground while Dr. Hannu tested the door. She pressed her full weight against it and sighed when it didn't budge. Well, this wasn't a part of the plan, she said. She walked back to the desk and spared a glance at Kirishima as she began to pack away her laptop in a slim carrying bag. She paused as she noticed rivulets of blood oozing from puncture wounds in his sides, where his hardened fingers dug deep into his skin. Hurting yourself won't make it stop, she said. It will only heighten your distress. There are facilities on this campus for rutting alphas, and your teachers will likely sedate you and take you there for the duration of your rut. The less you resist, the easier you will make it for them to help you. Take advantage of Yui's resources while you have them. Shut up, Kirishima hissed. His voice was rough, gravelly, and an octave too low. She considered him for a moment and moved back to the door. Break this down for me, and I will leave you alone. It shouldn't take long for your teachers to arrive. No, Kirishima panted, leaning forward until his hardened forehead scraped along the ground. He twisted so he could glare at her over his shoulder. You're dangerous. They need to catch you. Hannu watched him, cool and calculating. Is that how it's going to be, Kirishima-kun? You murdered my doctor. I didn't. One of my colleagues did. Surely you don't think I'm alone in my concern for people like you? You don't care about me. Kirishima snarled. Aggression shuddered through him, but he held it back, trembling, his hardened fingers digging gashes into his side. Hannu looked from him to the door and released a slow sigh. Well, then I guess you leave me no choice. A sharp cry erupted from her throat. The room filled with pheromones. Alpha, she whimpered, her voice suddenly frantic. Kirishima's head snapped up. His pupils blew open wide, pushing the red of his irises into thin rings. Alpha, they took him. They took your Omega. He's not my Omega, Kirishima breathed, gripping himself harder. He's in danger, she wailed. They're going to hurt him. He's in danger, Alpha. They took your Omega. Stop! Kirishima snarled. The air was thick with the awful scent. He lunged up from the ground, his skin crawling, panic pulsing more and more quickly through his veins. 𝗲𝗲𝗔𝗂𝘁𝗵𝗏. He paced around the room, rubbing his arms, hardening, unhardening. He tore the sleeves from his costume and ripped off the shoulder guards. The smell kept assaulting his senses. Her voice was terrible, her wailing ceaseless. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. He smelled blood. Pain shot up his sides. Her words strung together until it was a chorus of horrible, desperate begging in his head. He punched through the wood of the desk in the room, splintering it with his hardened fist. It didn't help. It didn't lift the cloud. It didn't clear the red. I drew the door. With a thundering roar, he charged the door, tearing at the wood and the walls that surrounded it with his body in full unbreakable. He punched wildly, clawing chunks of wood away from tape and ripping a jagged hole through crumbling concrete. His body fell through to the other side, and he dragged himself out into the hallway, panting heavily and shivering with adrenaline. "Thank you, Kirishima-kun," Dr. Hannu said as she stepped out of the room. "I hope we meet again someday." He vomited, heaving through his whole body. She took that as enough of a goodbye and turned to walk down the hallway. Gasping in the fresh air and covered in a sheen of sweat, Kirishima stumbled back and rested against the rubble of the broken wall. The blood from his side smeared across the debris. 𝗧𝗏 waited until Hannu was out of earshot and popped out of the shadow enough to whisper into his microphone. "I have eyes on the villain. And on Kirishima. He's dem. This guy has a huge. Give him some privacy," Vlad said gruffly, and he switched to a different camera feed. The students in the room shifted uncomfortably. "Follow the villain. We can let Eraserhead know where she plans to exit." "Got it." "Fuck this," Bakugo hissed under his breath. "Fuck this. Fuck this." "Just keep your cool, man," Kaminari whispered. "Aizawa-sensei's going to catch her. She can't pull that crap against 𝗬𝗏. "Kirishima is tough," Kaken, Midoriya said. "He'll be okay." Bakugo only replied with a tch. "Look, Aizawa-sensei's there now," Uraraka said, pointing to one of the screens. Outside, Aizawa joined Mina, Shiro, and Ajaru where they waited, huddled outside the building. Ajaru squatted with his arms wrapped around his waist, trying to hide his own shameful reaction to Kirishima's sudden pre-rut pheromones. Shiro knelt down to comfort him, but Mina had enough sense as an alpha to give him space. She turned with uncharacteristic severity to Aizawa as he came upon them. "Sensei," she said. "Kirishima." "I'm aware of the situation." Aizawa cut her off. "Ajaru, shake it off. Both of you need to get to the observation room immediately. Shiro, you may stay for support if you feel up to it. The 1B team should be exiting soon, and Kendo can help as well." 𝗧𝗏 is trailing the villain inside. She appears to be moving to the west exit, which is where the 1B team was instructed to go as well. "We need to move to cut her off so she doesn't have an encounter with 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏 or 𝗧𝗵𝗏𝗏. "She got out?" Shiro asked. "I sealed her in." "She tricked Kirishima into breaking down the wall," Aizawa replied, and he tapped on his headpiece. "Vlad is providing updates." "Then, what about Kirishima? Should we go get him?" "Midnight and 𝗵𝗲𝗃 are on their way. Leave it to them." Mina and Shiro exchanged a look, and Mina's face darkened. "Give her hell, Shiro," she said, a growl in her voice. "Calm down, Ashido," Aizawa said. "Go, before she gets out here." Mina nodded and waited for Shiro to help Ajaru up. He turned away from them and adjusted himself, red in the face, and trailed after Mina as they both jogged away to the safety of the underground observation room. Shiro and Aizawa turned in the opposite direction to head towards the west exit. Kendo, 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏, and 𝗧𝗵𝗏𝗏 had reached the bottom of the stairwell when they heard the access door to the second floor click open. A look crossed 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏's face, but Kendo shook her head firmly and pointed towards the exit. Lips pressed together, 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏 and 𝗧𝗵𝗏𝗏 continued out of the building, while Kendo ducked around a corner to hide in waiting. "Sensei," 𝗧𝗵𝗏𝗏 called as Aizawa and Shiro sprinted to a stop outside the doors. "We heard the villain coming down the stairs. Is there really nothing we can do?" 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏 demanded. "Does she still have Kirishima?" "We can handle it." "Fall back," Aizawa said. He punctuated this statement with a glare that left no room for argument. Scowling, 𝗧𝗵𝗲 ducked his head and joined 𝗧𝗵𝗲 in retreat. Aizawa's earpiece crackled. "She's coming your way," Vlad said. Aizawa pulled Dsuro to the side of the door and waited. As soon as the door opened, Aizawa's binding cloth shot out in a blur of gray, pinning Dr. Hanu's arms to her body at the elbows. A look of surprise passed just briefly across her face, and she turned to level her sharp gaze on Aizawa. His eyes glowed with pinpoints of red, and his hair lifted from his head. Dsuro stood next to him, ready to provide more bindings if needed. Behind her, Kendo and Korwaro emerged from the building. "Sensei," Dr. Hanu said as a wry greeting, "you have a student inside who needs your assistance." "I'm aware," Aizawa said. "We'll take care of it. You'll be coming with me. Everyone here is a beta, and your quirk will be barely more than an annoyance for any of us. Don't resist." "I was merely helping out a patient," Hanu said lightly. "Nobody has any interest in your brand of help," Aizawa replied. "More like malpractice," Dsuro muttered. "I don't intend to go quietly. I hope you realize that much." Hanu's eyes bore into Aizawa's. "I know what you can do, Eraserhead, and you've given us an unwelcome demonstration of your abilities. I'm not impressed. You may have taken Kirishima by surprise, but it won't work again." Hanu breathed out a sardonic laugh. "Sensei," she said, a dark glint to her eyes, "do you know why feral alphas are so terrifying?" Aizawa tightened his grip on the binding cloth and didn't reply. "I'm sure you've heard urban legends of mothers exhibiting incredible power when their children are in danger, so much so that they're able to lift entire cars by themselves. Perhaps you've heard stories of the Viking berserker warriors in ages past, who worked themselves into such frenzies that they were likened to bears or wolves. Or maybe you've heard the modern-day accounts of individuals who can control surges of adrenaline at will to perform superhuman feats. Have you, Sensei? Get to the point. Humans have always been capable of great and terrible things when their inhibitions are quashed and their hormones fully unleashed," Hanu said. Her voice was quiet and sinister. "Add in meta abilities, and an otherwise harmless person can become a juggernaut. There is a prime alpha inside this building with an impressive quirk who needs your immediate assistance, Sensei. I know what latent power he possesses. Do you?" Aizawa pressed his lips together. Hanu smirked. "I suggest you release me before things get ugly, Eraserhead." Aizawa studied her face, trying to find signs to call her bluff. "What did you inject into him?" he asked. "What else did it do to him?" "The serum has done everything it was designed to do, in theory. It is still in the testing stages, but I'm confident that this test run will be successful." "Test run?" Aizawa repeated, his expression darkening. "So you targeted Kirishima to be a test dummy for your experimental drug?" Hanu tilted her head in acquiescence. "I suppose you could say that. We have already run plenty of tests, but we needed to run a proper trial. It should be safe. And there's a chance it will make him feral?" "I already told you, Sensei, the serum has done everything it was supposed to, if it's working properly. It's meant to revitalize his damaged systems and amplify his natural strengths. The rut is merely a side effect. By all means, it should be a normal, well, abnormally aggressive rut. It may be alarming, but it won't make him feral." She put on a derisive smile, and Aizawa narrowed his eyes. "You're too far away for your pheromones to reach him," he said. "And I'm erasing your scent." "Correct. I can erase the power of your cries." "So it would seem." The expression on her face goaded him. "If your goal were truly to help Kirishima," he said, watching for her reaction, "it would be counterproductive for you to trigger him in any way. It is also counterproductive to get captured. I have many more things to accomplish beyond Kirishima's liberation. Many more patients to help. I don't expect a beta to understand the big picture. And I don't expect a villain to care about the damage they cause in pursuit of their grand delusions," Aizawa growled. "Sorry, but we won't let someone assault our student and get away with it." Hanu smirked. "Assault? I haven't assaulted anyone. Yet." Without further warning, she pressed the pad in her palm connected to the gauntlet hidden beneath the sleeve of her coat and dropped a small cylinder into her hand. She aimed and pressed a button, and it squirted a viscous liquid directly at Aizawa's face. He hissed and recoiled as the caustic substance burned his eyes. "Sensei," Dsuro said, stepping forward to help as 𝗧𝗏 rubbed frantically at his eyes. Taking advantage of the brief window she had made for herself, Hanyu threw her head back and released a devastating, heart-stopping shriek. The sound of it ripped through the air with the ferocity of a gunshot, but it lasted, reverberating through the empty cityscape. Its tenor evoked a primal fear of pain, of death, of incredible danger. Everyone at the scene flinched, the hair on their bodies rising on end. In the observation room, the Alpha students' hands shot up to cover their ears, and the Omega students cowered. The speakers blasted a cacophony of shrieks, cries, wails, an overwhelming string of Alpha, "Help me please, oh God, Alpha." The sound clawed through their bodies like glass in their bloodstreams. It conjured ghost pain across their skin and mental images of torture, mutilation, trauma. The mechanisms of their fight-or-flight instincts made everybody as tense as their worst moments of fear had ever made them. Fumbling and nearly blinded in his panic, Vlad finally managed to mute the audio feed, his breathing ragged. In the silence, everyone could hear their heartbeats pounding in their heads. "What was that?" Shoji demanded, his limbs tucked into himself in his rush to mute the noise. I feel like I'm going to be sick," Aoyama said, his hand over his mouth. Despite covering his own ears and growing noticeably pale, Ida said, "Calm down, everyone. We can't get worked up. It's just her quirk. They'll have it erased again in a second." "No, this is bad," Byakugan said, ignoring the way his own gut roiled with nausea. He stared at the screen. He saw Kendo and Korwara look up, eyes widening, and watched Zero spare glances in the same direction between helping 𝗧𝗏 pull out his eye drops and flush out his eyes. Gritting his teeth, Byakugan shouted at Vlad, "Turn the sound back on." Vlad scowled, but he moved his finger to hover over the button. "Brace yourselves," he said, and he pressed it down. The screeching immediately bellowed again through the speakers, but below the commotion, another sound grew. Low booms, cracks, crunching. They heard Kirishima before they saw him. On the second story of the building, the external concrete wall blew out in a blast of debris. Kirishima jumped through the dust, and his hardened body cracked the asphalt beneath him where he landed. Even from meters away, the microphones on the Beta heroes picked up the deep, guttural growl pouring from his throat. His hardening disengaged, revealing his crazed, bloodshot eyes, his pupils open wide and lightless like black holes. His sharp teeth were bared, wolf-like. The corners of his mouth foamed with spit. Dust settled and caked in the blood on his sides. He was indecent beneath his clothes in the early throes of his rut. "Stop," he growled. The Alpha command stunning even the students in the observation room for a second. Hanu's shrieking came to a sudden halt as 𝗧𝗏 and Zero finally managed to flush out his eyes. "Shit," 𝗧𝗏 breathed, straining against the urge to blink. He lifted his golden goggles to his face. "Prepare yourselves. Don't let her sense, Sensei," Zero said, turning to face Kirishima. "We'll immobilize him." Hanyu released a breathy laugh. "Don't underestimate him," she said. "He's beyond your comprehension now." Kirishima's face twisted into a fierce snarl, and he lurched into a reckless sprint. "I'll hold him," Kendo yelled, rushing forward. Her fists grew to enormous proportions and clapped together with a boom, encasing Kirishima's body totally. She clamped down, grimacing as she fought to hold him. An animal howl escaped the fleshy prison, and Kendo cried out as a sharp and hardened hand punctured through the middle of her palm with a spray of blood. Her grip loosened, and Kirishima's leg shot out to push against her and pry her fingers apart, both of his hands slashing ruthlessly at her skin. He turned and opened his jaw wide, baring his fangs. His hardened teeth closed on the vulnerable flesh between her thumb and index finger, and he ripped savagely through, digging to the bone. His hand pulled back through Kendo's palm, taking skin and muscle with it in its claws. Crying out, Kendo let him go, shrinking her hands back down to their usual size, where they hung in a limp, bloody mess. The observation room erupted into shock and panic. "What the heck, what the heck?" Mineta shouted, gripping his head in horror, and 𝗧𝗏 yelled, "Blood Sensei, we have to do something." Midoriya didn't notice Byakugan leave until he heard the door slide shut behind him. "Vlad Sensei," he tried to shout, but Vlad was yelling into the microphone, telling Kendo to back down as Kirishima, beast-like, rounded on her.
Get back.
𝗧𝗏 called, jumping to the side and wrapping Kirishima in a whirlwind of tape. It pinned his arms to his side, and for a miraculous second, it seemed to stop him. But his body burst into full unbreakable, the serrated ridges shredding the tape. With speed and agility that he had never shown before, Kirishima released the hardened form, grabbed the line of tape, and yanked 𝗧𝗏 towards him. 𝗧𝗏 lurched forward with a yelp, and Kirishima lunged to him, toppling him over with a thud. In a blur, Kirishima straddled him, pulled back a hardened arm, and thrust his blade-like hand through 𝗧𝗏's abdomen. The noise that escaped 𝗧𝗏's throat broadcast through the observation room. All beta students, prepare to mobilize. Vlad commanded. Vlad-sensei. Midoriya shouted, running forward. Kakin left. What? Vlad roared. Somebody go get him. Several of the beta students from 1A volunteered and ran from the room, followed in a rush by the other remaining beta students. Vlad glanced at the screens, looking for Bakuga's figure on any of them, but his attention snapped back to the main display as Hanu spoke. Her voice was smooth, like she hadn't unleashed hell with it moments before. What will it be, Eraserhead, she drawled. Her sharp eyes were lidded with smug delight as Aizawa stared her down, a dark scowl on his face at the sounds of combat. He couldn't spare a glance away, even as he heard 𝗧𝗏 cry out in pain. Will you let your student bleed out in order to hold me here? Shouldn't you be more worried about Kirishima's quirk, rather than mine? His is deadly. Aizawa ground his teeth together, and in a second he made his decision. He turned his erasure on Kirishima, who was lifting his hand to land another serious blow. The hardening disappeared from Kirishima's arm, but his fist still came down hard on 𝗧𝗏's torso, still dangerous without its sharpness. Aizawa dropped the binding cloth from Hanu and whipped it instead to wrap around Kirishima's forearm. He could smell Hanu's pheromones floating through the air as he pulled Kirishima back. 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏, apply first aid, he said, yanking Kirishima towards him. 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏 set his jaw and leaped forward. He anticipated Kirishima's attack and dodged, sliding underneath Kirishima's arm and diving seamlessly into the black of 𝗧𝗏's hero costume, where he waited until Kirishima was dragged far enough away to be safe. He popped out and applied pressure to 𝗧𝗏's wounds, using the fabric from his own costume to stymie the bleeding. Aizawa struggled to pull Kirishima away from the injured students, and he kept his eyes on him, preventing him from tapping into the enhanced strength that came with his hardening. Get it together, Kirishima, he shouted. Kirishima turned his attention to Aizawa with a snarl, and he suddenly stopped resisting the cloth, changing course towards Aizawa instead. Aizawa lurched backwards as the cloth unexpectedly slackened. He took a step back to regain his balance, but as his foot came down, a swift kick knocked it out from beneath him, bringing him to the ground. He rolled to a defensive position and looked behind him. Good luck, sensei, Dr. Hanu said with a laugh. She bolted away, disappearing again into the entrance of the building. A vicious growl rose in volume, and reflexively, Aizawa covered his face and neck with his arms. Teeth tore through his sleeves. Blood splashed onto his face, and he winced, but he kept himself from closing his eyes. Kirishima's scent was biting, harsh, so palpable Aizawa could taste it. His teeth, even without hardening, were sharp and jagged. His eyes were crazed, empty of human logic. He bit in rapid succession, ripping at Aizawa's forearms, tearing down to the tendons. Calm down, Aizawa shouted, but he knew it was useless. Kirishima. A sudden shout rang out from down the empty street, and Kirishima froze. The voice was all too familiar, and Aizawa felt his blood run cold. Bakugo, get back inside, he yelled. Kirishima's mouth went slack, blood dribbling down his chin. His growling stilled. He looked down the street, enraptured. Kirishima, what the hell are you doing? Why are you playing with a bunch of idiot betas, huh? Bakugo called. His voice taunted. He reached up and peeled off his scent patches. The breeze blew past him, carrying his scent downwind towards the carnage. This is what you want, isn't it? Damn it, Bakugo, Aizawa shouted, grabbing at Kirishima as the alpha moved to stand, his eyes fixed on the source of the omega scent. It was sweet, purposefully enticing, The worst scent an omega could make in the presence of a feral, rutting alpha. I'm not interested in weak, shitty alphas, hair for brains, Bakugo said, ignoring Aizawa. If you want it, you're going to have to come and fucking take it. Baku. A kick in the face cut Aizawa off. Kirishima ran towards Bakugo in a full sprint. Bakugo blasted from the ground in a series of bright explosions, flying backwards with incredible speed, staying upwind from Kirishima's pheromones. Kirishima chased after him, his eyes fixed on his quarry. As Bakugo rushed away, a wall of concrete flew up. Kirishima ran into it with a snarl, and more walls emerged to encase him in a prison of concrete. Bakugo skidded to a halt, his eyes wide with surprise. "Give me a funnel," Midnight shouted, running to the concrete cell. "Got it," 𝗬𝗵𝗲 said, and a funnel appeared. Midnight ripped the fabric near her shoulder and began to spill the sleep-inducing powder through the opening. The howling from within was overwhelming, even to Bakugo, who stood many meters away. The sound had the unmistakable draw of an alpha in rut, and the pheromones spilled out, nearly buckling Midnight's knees. She kept herself steady, holding her breath. A hardened hand burst out from the weak juncture between the main concrete box and the makeshift funnel, and the concrete began to crumble. Kirishima's face pushed at the hole as he tried to claw his way out. Midnight kept pumping out her sleep dust. "Omega," Kirishima growled, his voice hoarse, deep, husky. The command hit them like a physical blow. The color drained from Midnight's face, but she grit her teeth. Bakugo stood absolutely frozen. "Come here." Bakugo took a step forward, mouth agape, but before he could break into a run, a new, thick barrier of concrete rose in front of him to surround Kirishima and Midnight, blocking all paths to them. With the two of them out of sight, the newly arrived beta students could only wait for Kirishima's snarls to fade as he fell asleep.